Good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to one of the Bremen's excellent book talks that we are known for. My name is Phyllis Lazarus. I work here at the Bremen. I do a lot of the programming and PR. If you have any suggestions for more book talks, please let me know. You all are so lucky. I feel so lucky to have Jessica here today. I picked up her book this week and I literally could not put it down. It just blew me away. It's a real page turner, and even though the subject's difficult, it was not depressing. It was meaningful. I want to read you just a few accolades that this book has been getting nationwide by different critics. One person said this book is a gift. Another person, Kirkus book, said a heartfelt, painful family saga skillfully told by a survivor. And my favorite, and this is so true, is Teresa Weaver from Atlanta Magazine. Some memoirs are affecting because they are universal, some because they are unique. Jessica Handler's Invisible Sisters derives its gut punch power from being both. Handler tells his story with the lyrical elegance and cool remove of Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking, the highest praise possible for any memoir of loss. There is an undeniable burden in being the, quote, only one left, but there is true grace in the act and art of first remembering, then surviving. And if you haven't read this book, you're in for a treat to hear her and then read this book. I didn't say much about Jessica. She's going to tell you more about what she does today. I know that she teaches writing, among other things, at the Art Institute, and she was the Peter Taylor Nonfiction Fellow at Kenyon College this summer, which is in Ohio. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Jessica Handler.
What I want to do is tell you a little bit about the story. I'm going to take off my bracelets because they clank when I'm mic'd, and I didn't try that out when I got dressed because I don't have a microphone in my house. So this should be a little bit better. There you go. I'm the oldest of three sisters, and at 32, I was the only one living. My sister Susie died of leukemia when she was 8, and I was 10. Our younger sister Sarah was 4 when Susie died. Sarah was born with a blood disorder called Costman's syndrome that's so rare it's only found in about 1 in every 2 million people. She wasn't expected to live past the age of 3 or 4. She died when she was 27, and I was 32. Invisible Sisters, though, celebrates my family, Jews who were new to the American South during the civil rights years of the 1960s. And in the archives, I looked us up. I looked us up in like an Atlanta city directory, and I was like, oh, there we are. My parents moved to Atlanta in 1965 when my father, who was an attorney, took a job with the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. He came here because he saw parallels in the historical oppression of Jews and the goals of the civil rights movement. He took me with him to Dr. Martin Luther King's funeral when I was 8 years old. My sisters and I were raised with the concept from the Pirkei Avot that asks, if I'm only for myself, what am I? As Jews, though, we learn that if you save one life, it's as if you save the world. But my family could not, in these circumstances, save their own. Invisible Sisters is the story of how I learned to save myself and to find myself as the only one left. So what I'd like to do is read from the book, then open it to questions. Oh, there goes the bracelet. I daydream about my sisters all the time. One whispers in my ear as I write. Another suggests an afternoon snack. Look, an old round Volvo, I say aloud to no one when changing lanes on the freeway. We were sentimental about those tank-like little cars. Our parents each had one when we were small, a green one for Mom, a red one for Dad. The license plate numbers even matched, different by a single digit. When the weather is warm, I daydream about an imaginary afternoon on a late summer vacation, the three of us together. Susie and Sarah and I lie on the periphery of a body of water, a glittering blue swimming pool somewhere almost shabby, maybe a motel with microwaves and concrete patios along the Gulf Coast of Florida, or somewhere more beautiful, a salt sticky beach on Cape Cod. At least one of us makes good money if we've decided to go to the Cape. Mindful of the demands on husbands and kids, we have pried 1 week from our separate calendars, drawing red pencil squares around that block of days set aside for soggy towels and frayed tennis shoes that leak sand like cracked hourglasses. Each of us has had our share of bad love affairs, dropped out of school, gone back to school. We've traveled to Europe or out west, slung hash, gotten speeding tickets, gotten high, gotten married. We have children. Susie and Sarah and I are devoted to one another, even though we've made our homes in different cities. Sarah might have studied art history or become a doctor or a writer. She was surgically exact with words. Susie, who when she was 6 wanted to be a nurse, may have earned her doctorate in nursing. If she teaches, her students adore her. She's tough on them, but her laugh is a happy spike in a steady current of energy. I haven't grown up to be the TV star I planned to be when I was 8, flipping my hair and practicing that girl's intoxicating smile. Ilya Kuryakin, the Russian secret agent from The Man from U.N.C.L.E., he didn't elope with me. Instead, I'm the sister grown up. My sisters and I have created a tribe of children still unaware that their job will be to remember us. Our sons and daughters see us as moms and indistinctly as sisters. We bicker and we roll our eyes. Keeping peace, we don't speak about certain things, a borrowed car that came back with a cigarette burn in the upholstery, or an emergency loan for a college weekend still unpaid. Lee's history of boyfriends, at Sarah's orderly cooking, at my tall tales. We worry about our parents growing old, and we avoid talking about what we will do when they can no longer live alone. Our dream children look like their mothers. Mine tend toward plumpness. Susie's are forceful and athletic. Sarah's are elegant. They shout and argue and make peace in predictable cycles. They smell like the vapor from their sunscreen, baked chemical coconut desserts. We 3 lie flat on our backs on chaise lounges, near enough to our offspring to stay alert to their safety. Marco, my children yell. Polo, their cousins holler back. Our husbands never materialize in this fantasy. It's just us. We sisters drowse in the sun, happy to be side by side with next to nothing to do. As I write this, I'm 47, the eldest. Susie would be almost 46. Sarah would be 42. The book jumps around in time. It starts as a reminiscence, and then it goes back through our childhoods, and then in the last half of the book it becomes an exploration of how I learned to come home and how I learned to understand my family. And in writing this book, I used my childhood journals, stacks of them. Every girl in this room kept a diary, I know it. And stacks of those. I also wrote away from my sister's medical records, 2,500 pages alone from Sloan Kettering, and really spent a lot of time with that kind of material. But what I want to do here is move with you to Atlanta in 1965. Less than a year after voting rights activists Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman, 2 white men and 1 black, were murdered in Mississippi, Mom found herself in the culturally uncharted South. Like adventurers of old, we had come to make our home, she said in amazement. Deeper south than South Carolina. My mother wasn't worried for our safety. She was just 30, eager to experience a new way of life. We experienced no racial tension ourselves. Our neighborhood and those surrounding it were almost entirely populated by white families, a product of custom and laws yet to come. I knew a few Cuban children, a few more from South America, and several from Greek families. The struggles in the larger world seemed to me separate from the evenly paced and smiling daily life in our neighborhood. I moved to Atlanta in 1965 because my father believed he had a chance to change the world. He was the son of a lawyer who had become known among champions of social justice, a man who had argued and won a case before the U.S. Supreme Court in 1953. The case, Garner versus Teamsters Union, the court upheld the rights of union members to picket for fair wages. A framed photograph of my victorious, smiling grandfather posing with his legal team on the mammoth steps of Chief Justice Earl Warren's court was displayed in my grandparents' house in Pennsylvania. A reverent hush signaled my grandfather's arrival into almost any room. His presence alone seemed to indicate that it was possible to fight injustice and win. After 2 years in Detroit, my father took a job with the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the labor union that had become widely known in the aftermath of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in Manhattan in 1911. The union was a client of my grandfather's. My great-aunt Mary worked as a secretary in the New York office. Even before I started first grade, I knew to follow the instructions in the union song and look for the union label in every coat, dress, or blouse. I'm not going to sing it, don't worry. Early 1960s, cotton grew outside the towns in Georgia, the Carolinas, Alabama, and Mississippi. Factories where workers wove, cut, and sewed the towels and sheets and shirts and pants made from that cotton drove much of the economy of the rural South. The union came to fight inequity in the workplaces of the Jim Crow South. My father saw the Southern labor movement as his opportunity to do what his father had done and fight injustice in the world. The year we arrived, Atlanta's Jewish population was 15,000 people, an increase of about 1,000 from the prior year. The city's total population had just passed 1 million. That exuberant number sparkled from a sign made of light bulbs at the entrance to a high-rise apartment building on Peachtree Road. My mother wanted to see for herself the kinds of names the real estate agent promised her were on curbside mailboxes: Golden, Siegel, Bergman. The presence of other Jews promised that the intellectual tradition my parents knew existed in that foreign land below the Mason-Dixon line. My parents hadn't grown up attending synagogue beyond weddings, bar mitzvahs, and funerals, and they didn't intend to start now. But being Jewish was simply who we were, like being a family or being Americans or having 10 fingers and 10 toes. I had never heard any prayers and had no formal Jewish education. My father simply trusted us to comprehend tyranny. Jews had experienced exile and contempt for thousands of years, he told me. Jews knew slavery, Jews knew freedom, which made right-thinking Jews sympathetic to the civil rights movement. My parents knew little Hebrew and only casual Yiddish, which my father used primarily for cursing. Shmata, a rag, as in a piece of clothing, what Southern cotton was made into. Drek, my singing along with Sugar, Sugar by the Archies. Sometimes, for him, Yiddish described food. Schmaltz, cooked chicken fat spread like jam across a slice of rye bread. My mother's sporadic Yiddish in her Massachusetts broad speech was endearment. Watch your kepi, your head, when you ducked into the low basement stairwell. If I worried too much, I would give myself tsuris, troubles. Susie and Sarah and I absorbed Southern accents easily. My mother, miffed by a bank teller's inquiring after her chicken account, was unaccustomed to the foreign tongue. My father, however, took to the dialect easily after a difficult start. For years, he recounted the day he paled and backed away when a hostess at a reception waved ice tongs at him and sweetly asked her if he cared for what he thought sounded like a piece of ass. I want to jump ahead. He told that story until he died. I want to jump ahead to a later point in the book, after my sister Susie has died, after my sister Sarah has died, and my husband and I have gone to visit my sister Sarah's grave in Massachusetts. And we've gone without my mother, without my father, and visited the grave, and then we're leaving. My mother's parents are buried side by side in an older, shadier section of the cemetery. My grandfather died in his 60s of a heart attack. My grandmother lived 20 years more until her heart failed. Having no more stones to leave, I place a butterscotch candy next to my grandfather's name and a mint beside my grandmother's. I chatted with them. You never know. I introduced my husband. He said hello. It was reassuring to be near the last physical place of the people I love. The middle initial of my grandmother's name stands for her maiden name, Brownstein. The birth date on my grandfather's headstone marks a day in Russia in 1904, before the revolution, in a town on the eastern length of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. People cease to live, and the information that adds up to equal the facts of their lives goes missing as fewer of us stand here above ground. The cabbie who drove us back to the train station was a chatty man with sagging face and wiry black hair. He looked like my Russian grandfather. When he speaks, it's with a vaguely Eastern European accent, the sharp consonants washed to softness like the starch in hard-worn jeans. In the back seat of his cab, I dig through my purse for the train schedule and my wallet. My husband rests his hand on my thigh, keeping me rooted in the living. I've already put on my sunglasses to hide my emotion. But our cabbie has driven this route before, and he sees right through me. It's almost Yizkor, he says gently. Yom Kippur is a month away. Even as an unobservant Jew, I cleave to the high holy days of the Jewish New Year, the days to consider beginnings and endings. It's good to remember, the cabbie says, almost casually, as he drives us slowly out of the gates and on the main road into town. And what I'd like to do is close with the end of the book, which doesn't really give anything away, because the whole point of a memoir is that one has made it to the other side. So I'm going to close with that, if I may, and then open it to questions. It's midnight in August 1974. I'm up late, as usual. I'm almost 15. My parents are asleep if they're both home, the TV blurting the 11 o'clock news, then Carson, then clicked off. If my father isn't home, my mother's been reading in the bedroom that she has made neat and tidy, with the radio tuned to the classical station. She wipes Nivea cream on her face, one hand to each cheek, then places her book on her nightstand and turns out the light, free to dream. Sarah sleeps in her bedroom across the hall from mine. I'm still dressed. I've been reading, lying on my stomach down the length of my bed, listening as the house goes quiet for the night. Now that my family is down, I am up. I have a spiral notebook in my lap and a pen in my hand. A coffee mug that I keep for an ashtray leans against my thigh. In preparation for writing, I've dumped the old cigarette butts into my trash can. Fresh cigarette. I don't smoke anymore, by the way. My radio alarm clock is tuned where it always is, radio station WQXI, Quixie and Dixie. Eric Clapton sings, "I Shot the Sheriff." I reach over and I tug the chain on my desk lamp. The sudden yellow beam of light makes me shield my eyes for a second, but I have a lot to write tonight. I don't write about marriage or the perfect job or kids. I don't write about what I want to come true when I grow up. I don't know this yet, but I'm writing messages and sending them away in bottles that will wash up on a future show where I will find them when I'm an adult. I'm so glad for the journal memory bank. My journals affirm that I was there too. I was there diligently recording my existence on the page, reminding myself that I mattered. Death is permanent, but I knew without daring to admit it that living while drowning in dread can be temporary. I knew then that my family's rough voyage would end, and when it did, my compass needle would wobble and settle and point in the direction where I would find myself. I had devoted myself to trying to save people I loved, obscuring what I knew, that I loved myself too. I couldn't save my sisters, but in my journals, I worked to save myself. Years before my sister Sarah spoke the words, I knew without being told that I would be the only one left. Who else would I be then, when I became sisterless? I would be the memory keeper, admiring the glinting beauty of my sisters' lives and the promise in what our family had been. As I admired, I taught myself to see me again, the visible sister, with days behind me and days wide open ahead. Thank you so much. What I'd like to do, if I could, is answer any questions at all about the book, about my family, about the writing process, anything that you'd like to ask me at all. I am here to do that. Yes?
How long did it take you to put all these journals together and the way the book is different? You jump around so much.
I have a picture that I used to bring to readings, and then I stopped doing it, I think, because it got crushed in my briefcase, which is a photograph of all the chapters in this book in manuscript form laid out from the front door, through the living room, down the hallway, up the stairs, down the second floor hall, through the master bedroom, and into the bathroom. And what this was all the chapters, and then literally I would move them around with the help of my editor, but I go, chapter 9 really makes more sense here, but then that means that chapter 13 really has to be chapter 20. So there was a physical waltzing with the paper. I started keeping journals when I was, 9, and kept them really diligently throughout my life. And what that meant is when I wrote this book, I went through all of them with a highlighter, with tape flags, and read what I needed to go through to retell this story. Because our memories are very strong, but they're also fallible. When did such and such happen? Was that before this or after that? And so I would highlight and use tape flags. And what it helped me do was recapture the voice and the perspective of me at 10, 15, 20 years old. Because if you look back on that as an adult, you may remember it, but that's not the voice you had as a teenager. And those journals, too, they were very teenage journals. There were lots of pages about, you know, whose party I went to, or who didn't invite me out, or I got grounded and I'm in trouble and I hate everybody. So there was a lot of that. And in comparing that with my sister's medical records, it created this parallel existence for this family. So one answer is my whole life. And the other answer is about 3 years to write the book. Yes, sir?
In front of your book, there's written a picture, and it really explains what it's all about.
Yeah.
Just by looking at it, it's a reflection of her walking along the street.
Didn't they do a great job?
Who came up with that?
That is designed by someone named Olga Grillik at the publishing house. You can see the credit on the back page. And what happens is everyone I know who is an author always warns you and says, oh, when you see your cover image, you're going to hate it. Your agent's going to have to call them and spank them. And I was very nervous. And I got a JPEG. I got a digital image from my editor that says, here's your cover design. And I'm going, okay, here we go. And I clicked on it, and I liked it so well. I have a laptop. I liked it so well, I shut my laptop. I said, oh, this can't be true. And it took me a few looks to see what she'd done with the 3 reflections. And it's stock photo that she manipulated. I guess she used Photoshop or After Effects or something. So Olga did a wonderful job. Yeah, she really did. And this picture, my mother actually called me and she said, did they get a picture of you? Because when I was about the age, I wore my hair that way. I think I still do. Yes?
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I should know that.
Yeah, I should know that.
I should know that. I apologize. That question was about the cover image, and the question before was how long did it take me to write the book? The book. Yes?
What do your parents think of the book?
What do my parents think of the book? My father is deceased, and I didn't write it until he was deceased, which wasn't a deliberate act on my part, as in I can't do this until my father dies, but I think on some level I was free to do it then. My mother and I are very close, and she was involved with this throughout in terms of my calling her and saying, this is what I remember. Or at one point she came over with a huge box of my sister's medical records that she had, bills, and just put them on the dining room table. And before this was published, I gave her the manuscript in a manila folder and just said, read it. I'm not going to change it, but I want you to know what's in here, and if there's anything you have a real issue with, let's talk about. The only thing that she had an issue with was I'd gotten the name of a brand of face cream wrong. That was it. My mom's a hero. So, yeah. Yes?
I am one of 3 sisters, so when I saw the blurb come out from Freeman, I knew that I wanted to be here.
Thank you.
I know the joys of sisters. Tell me how you cope with the loss of your sisters. Was it through writing? Did it help, or what?
Long process. I think that keeping the journals, how did I cope with the loss of my sisters? Long process. I think keeping the journals was a lifelong habit that I think any writer has that helps them explain the world to themselves. And I was, to some extent, obsessive about keeping journals. You know, the spiral-bound notebooks the kids use in school, I would go through, those are like 30, 40 pages. I'd go through one of those in 2 or 3 weeks. So I wrote and wrote and wrote. I acted out when I was a teenager. I was somewhat unruly. Perhaps that's the era, or perhaps it was me. And also there is something called well sibling syndrome, which is mostly assigned to the siblings of people who are mentally disabled, but I think it also applies to the physically disabled. And what a well sibling is that is the child who realizes that his or her parents are overwhelmed and realizes that it is upon them to make the dinner, walk the dog, do whatever they can do, and keep their own emotions and needs in check, which isn't done in a hostile way or it's not done in a resentful way. In a way, the Wells sibling steps up to the plate. And that's what I did for a long time. And, yeah. Yes?
I wonder, in reading the book, it seems as though you got along with your sisters, you loved your sisters, and I wondered if that was also a Wells sibling thing, because most sisters love each other, but they don't always get along.
Right. The question is that it appears that I loved my sisters and my sisters loved me so throughout the book. So is that a Wells sibling attribute, or is that true?
It's the love, but
Yeah.
it didn't seem to be a lot of conflict.
Yeah, we got along. Susie and I mean, Susie only lived to be 8, so we did get along, but we definitely, I remember playing some pranks on her that I'm not going to discuss in public, but they, were the kind of pranks you play when you're a little kid. I remember teasing Sarah and making her angry and her teasing me. So in a way, we did have very, very normal lives, which included getting in each other's way, getting angry at each other. There's a point in the book where Sarah's in the maybe junior high and I'm in high school, and it's my job to babysit her because my parents are both working. And we both relished the fact that we could slam doors, that I could tell her to shut up, that she could put on headphones and listen to music and not talk to me. So we really tried very hard to be normal, and we loved that. So I didn't treat them and they didn't treat me with kid gloves. I think I left out, there were a few fights in here, but nothing really huge. I think we were very fortunate in that we got along very well. I don't know, had our lives been different, if maybe, what it would be like if we were all in our 40s now. But I like to think that we would have continued to get along. We did. So we were lucky. Yes?
Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Sure. Yes. My sister, I'm the oldest. My sister Susie was the middle, and my sister Sarah was the youngest. And the question is, what were the illnesses in the family? Susie had leukemia. She had ALL, which is the most common kind of leukemia. The prognosis for a child with ALL now is infinitely better than it was for a child diagnosed with ALL in the early 60s. At that point, it was pretty much a fatal illness. And what that is essentially an overabundance of white blood cells. What Sarah had was an illness called Kostman's syndrome, Kostmann', which actually was only discovered about 10 years before she was born. And what that is, it's so rare that only 1 in 2 million people is diagnosed with it. And it is an absence of neutrophils. It's called agranulocytosis, so it's the inability to produce granulocytes. So if Susie had an excessive amount of white blood cells on a very simple scale, and I'm not a doctor, I only researched this enough to understand what was happening in my family. If Susie had essentially an overabundance of white blood cells, Sarah had the inability to produce enough mature white blood cells to fight infection. And starting from a very young age, she couldn't combat infections, and she had surgery and lost a lung. She had brain surgery that was predicated off an infected tooth that spread up into her head. That kind of thing. That being said, though, she lived a very normal life when she was well. She had all the antibiotics in the world that only worked up to a point because you need to have white cells for them to work. And at one point there was a discussion about having a bone marrow transplant, but no donor was found, and it was early enough in the bone marrow transplant world that I don't believe there was a donor registry at that point. So it was an interesting thing because as far as any doctor I know knows, ALL and Kostman's have never been seen in the same family at the same time. So it's just what my mother called bizarre coincidence. Yes, sir.
And you said you perused 2,500 pages of medical records. I wondered what you were looking for and what you found.
Well, what happened was Sloan Kettering had 2,500 pages for Sarah. Eggleston had a couple of hundred. There were some other hospitals. What they ended up sending me were the discharge reports. So I ended up with 300 or 400 pages instead of 2,500 pages because I called the hospital and they told me, and there was this moment of, oh my gosh. What I was looking for, and I grew up reading the PDR. I speak doctor to some extent. So in terms of reading the language, I pretty much understood it. And then, of course, I had Gray's and I had medical dictionaries. I was looking to find out the truth of their lives, their experience as compared to mine. So, I could know that Sarah had gone into the hospital or Susie had gone into the hospital. And I knew what their medications were, even as a child, because it wasn't a house where somebody took a pill. It was a house where somebody took ampicillin. But I wanted to get inside their experience on a very bracing level and see what was this surgery, what was this medication, how long was this hospitalization and for what reason, and then compare that point in time with myself and how my life was so different, so similar to theirs. Same parents, same friends, same house, yet on a day-to-day level so different. And I think I found what I was looking for. Yes?
So Sarah, who's at Costume?
Correct.
Did she write journals or leave you any letters? Or
Yeah. Did Sarah keep journals? Sarah was a tremendous writer, and she was accepted into the writing program at Johns Hopkins and then was unable to go because she sprouted an infection. And I do have her journals. I have a crate of her journals. And I made a decision not to spend a lot of time with them. I looked at her calendars. I looked at some of her poems and short stories. But in terms of the real depth of her journals, I felt that I was plumbing her private life without her permission. I thought about that long and hard, and I decided not to do it. Yes, sir.
In terms of discussion, what was your mother and father's dining table?
What a fabulous question. In terms of discussion, what were my parents' dining table like at the evening, during the evening? I love that. I just came up with an image of myself diagramming sentences on the Formica in pencil because it would wipe off. What we talked about was my parents were not the kind of people who believed in children's table, adult table, or, kids should be seen and not heard. We were all three of us raised to be very involved in the care of our world, in the care of each other, and in reading and talking. What it was like, honestly, was there was a black and white 12-inch Zenith on the table that played the Vietnam War, the 6 o'clock news. And we talked about it, and we watched it. And when that wasn't on, it was Sesame Street. So, what does that tell you? We did not talk about illness, though. We talked about everything but. We talked about politics. We talked about school. We talked about Shakespeare. We talked about poetry. We talked about you have to eat your broccoli anyway. We didn't talk about illness because I don't know why. I think because in the 60s and 70s, it wasn't done. I mean, talking about illness in my parents' house, and I think in anyone's house in that era, serious illness. You wouldn't do it any more than you rip off your clothes in public or hurt a small animal. It just wasn't done. That being said, my parents were very empathetic and caring people. Their goal was to keep moving forward, to be as normal as possible, to be engaged with the world, especially because we were so unable to help the world in our bodies. So what can we do instead? That's pretty much what the dinner table was like. It was a very normal household. Sarah had a big pile of pills in front of her plate, but that was just how it was done.
What were the fights about?
What were the fights about? What fights? How old am I when I'm having these fights? What were the fights about at dinner?
What I'm trying to...
Yeah, where are we going?
Is a sense of the environment that you grew up in as a young person.
As a teenager, the fights were about I'm going out anyway, or I can too take the car, which is very normal, or I'm not going to come home after school and look after Sarah because she's going to a friend's house and I get to go to Eleanor's or somebody's. That's a friend. In terms of my parents, they did not have fights at the dinner table. They had fights behind closed doors, and that's a different kind of thing. Table was very civilized. Table was very civilized, and I think this is because my parents, as I said, really, really wanted this family to move forward and be as solid as it could be, even though things were coming out from beneath it. What else can I do? Yes?
In the first passage, it sounded such a wonderful idea of your sisters and you on vacation and almost hopeful for the future.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if, in both cases, if you had a sense, even being very young, that their illnesses were going to lead to death. And also, when I guess you and Sarah were the only two sisters left, how did you all commonly grieve? And did you make any sort of resolutions for the future in terms of how you would either form your own families or your perceptions as a result?
The question is that the opening passage sounds very hopeful, and so did I know as a child that I would be the only one left? And then as Sarah and I were together and living, did we make any plans for the future and how to grieve? We never talked about death. We never talked about death. The only one left passage, and I may find it and read it very quickly, is Sarah. Here we go. I'm going to go ahead and read this. The only time we ever talked about death in my family was Sarah made me do it about 3 years before she died. And it was, if you think about Tolstoy and the white bear in the corner, and about how you never, look at the white bear. Sarah had called me on a weekend afternoon. She lived near our mother outside Boston. I had moved back to Atlanta, where we had grown up. "This is going to be harder on you than it will be on me," Sarah said. She was getting ready for a bone marrow transplant. "I know," I replied. I was sulky, hating the fact that she had taken control and made me face the truth. While we talked, I imagined Sarah standing in her kitchen, looking out over Dorchester's rooftops and cutting vegetables for a snack she invented when she was a child, raw broccoli stalks dipped in olive oil and salt. We called them trees. "I can handle a hospital stay," I said. Out of habit, protecting myself, I had dismissed her again. A bone marrow transplant was all this conversation was about. I imagined months in sterile isolation for her and months for me if I passed the tests to be her donor. "That's not what I'm talking about," Sarah said. She sounded irritable and urgent. "When I die, that's what I mean." I made comforting noises, demurring. "You won't die from this. Don't be silly. This time will work. This will save your life." "When I die," Sarah said, suddenly fierce, "you'll be the only one left." It's the first time anyone in my family had ever spoken about it. We just didn't do it. So no plans were made, which means that my mother and I and my father were sort of washed up on that shore. I have a theory that when a person dies in your life, or when you lose a person in your life, it's almost as if you're on one of those moving sidewalks that you see at the airport or in shopping malls, and you're going along through your life, and you're going along on the moving sidewalk, and one day you look around, and it could be a week later, a month later, 10 years later, and you go, "Oh, I'm still here. What do I do now?" And that's kind of the way we did it. Yes?
It was very touching when you went to visit the grave.
Mm-hmm.
And in the earlier part of the book, you talked about how little Jewish ritual
Yeah.
had. And you described your husband picking up your
Mm-hmm.
prayer. And it seemed as though it meant something to you, and you really did know some of the words. And I wondered, was there more that sort of seeped in your family? Did they do more? Did they light a Yorkshire candle?
You know the theory about how all Jews know the Shema? We just know it. My husband is a very kind and thoughtful person, and he was raised in a more religious home than I was. And when we were at the grave at the cemetery in Boston, there was a card, there were cards, a mourner's Kaddish, and he picked them up. And I knew to put pebbles on the graves. I don't know how I knew that. And I knew some of the words of the mourner's Kaddish I don't know how I knew them. It may have been said at Susie's funeral. I don't recall. I may have heard it. I probably heard it in synagogue, but it wasn't something I knew how to do. And in terms of lighting yahrzeit candles at home, I do that now. We did not do it growing up. And because I do not know the Mourner's Kaddish by heart, I can print it out and read it off a card, and sometimes I do that. And sometimes I just sing a song that my sisters liked. It could be a song by the Grateful Dead. It could be a song by Bob Marley. It's just whatever seems right for me. So I do that now. I think that I just knew it, and I probably heard it in synagogue and heard it maybe at Susie's funeral. And also I think we just know it on some level. And also he's easy to follow along with. He speaks really well. So, anything else? Yes, ma'am.
I keep going back to you said that you wanted to see all the hospital records.
Yeah.
And I understand what your sister went through.
Yeah.
I guess we just worked differently, but you said you had the journals, and you felt it was her private world, and you just wanted to see.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm thinking that even now, sometimes I go through letters and I say, oh God, when I die, I should look over your 120.
Yeah.
I don't want anybody to see it. I tear it up.
Yeah.
I don't want it to be seen.
Yeah.
The fact that your sister, I mean, she knew she was going to die, but she didn't choose to say, I want these records, I want these journals out of here. Maybe she wanted you to see them. And I keep thinking, take this magic will pill on your part not to want to see that enterprise.
Yeah, I thought about it a lot. The question is, I think, why didn't I go through Sarah's journals when I went through? Well, she died on, even though she was expected to, even though her illness was fatal and no one knew when she would die. What happened was she died at home in the afternoon, and her boyfriend found her body. So it wasn't a hospitalization or any kind of a situation where a person starts to wind down. So what her plans were for them, I don't know. Maybe she wanted my mother to read them. Maybe she wants me to read them another time. I did a lot of thinking on that. I mean, did I read my sister's journals? Maybe it is. I don't know. They're in my attic, in a big cardboard box. So I may read them. The medical records felt different to me. Somehow medical records, even in this era of HIPAA regulations, the hospital released them to me. I signed a hold harmless, and my mother signed a hold harmless, so now I have them. In a way that's more public than a person's deep thoughts, and that's an interesting thing to think about, that the interior of your body and the workings of your body and very private things about surgery and this kind of stuff are somehow less private than your journals, but I think they are, at least in my understanding. So I want to thank you all so much for being part of this. I really appreciate it. And one of the honors that this book has given me is a sense of redemption in writing this. And so many people have come up to me in the past 6 months and said, I'm an only one left too, or I have experienced this, or I know someone who's experienced this. And I find that it's given me the ability to reach out to other people, and I really appreciate that. And I also appreciate all the people from my childhood and my mom's life who've come back into our lives. Nobody's mad at me. So thank you all.